All right, welcome for the first day of our precarious 2023 as we go into a new phase of human history with a lot of hope, but also a lot of trepidation. There's obviously a lot of potential for either direction, good or bad, to occur, and so we need to keep ourselves as sharp as humanly possible, maximizing that potential of the pursuit of wisdom such that we can capacity build and be the better people that we need to be as opportunities to do a lot of good arise at our doorstep, as they may increasingly happen, as they will increasingly happen. So what a better way to celebrate and usher in this New Year's pursuit of wisdom than with a class by Martin Sieff, who has blown my mind on numerous occasions, and I think a lot of people here share that same sentiment. We have had a series of presentations over the past months where Martin, who is a great friend, an advisor for the Rising Tide Foundation, has delivered some really good geopolitical insights into the Franco-Anglo insanity of the 19th century that gave birth to the disorder known as NATO in the 20th century. He's gone into deep dives into a lot of the insidious, underappreciated dynamics behind the rise of things like the Muslim Brotherhood, like a lot of the stuff that went on in Israel in the 1940s, 30s, 40s, 50s onward. And all of this is really important because we're being played on a variety of levels at the same time. And we have been led to believe that many of our liberties should be sacrificed for the sake of the ongoing war, the never-ending war on global terrorism, which we are told is a naturally arising sociological phenomenon, which when you start scratching at the surface, you start realizing that there's nothing natural about this. There's a lot of very artificial, interventions to weave and create and create this thing called Islamic terrorism as a political, not even religious institution. So as a follow-up to, I think, some of the topics that were raised in previous months, Martin will continue with this thread that we're pulling and seeing where it unravels with today's class, which I think has the title of the longest named class of the Rising Tide Foundation series ever.
That was my fault, of course.
Martin selected as The British in Iraq: Massacres, Ethnic Cleansing, Poison Gas, Crimes Against Humanity, Torture Chambers, and 3 Regicides. How the British Taught Democracy in the Arab World. So, with that said, anybody who has questions, keep them in mind. Martin, as you know, loves to address all sorts of questions, and I'm sure going to have a robust dialogue at the end of the presentation. So put your name in the chat box at Q. I'll call upon you in order as you put your name out there. Martin, thank you so much for doing this, and the stage is all yours.
The great Western nation, the dominant hyperpower of the West, militarily topples a despised, terrorizing, torture-using, national suppressing dictatorship, guilty of every human crime. And they are in the lands of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It actually gets a formal approval from the World Peace Organization to develop that nation and safeguard and support the development of a pro-Western, stable, free, democratic state dedicated to all good human rights values, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, an independent judiciary, and the rule of law in this nation, in these lands between around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, east and west of both of them. What could possibly go wrong? Iraq has just been liberated by the West. But we are not talking about 1991. We are not talking about 2003. We are talking about 1918. For the next 50 years, the British Empire will oversee the creation of a constitutional monarchy and free democracy in Iraq under a mandate that eventually in 1920s is approved by the League of Nations itself in Geneva, and then later happily renewed and taken over by the United Nations as well. Iraq will eventually become a fully independent sovereign nation with, of course, the British as their best friends and protectors to ensure democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, the development of the Iraqi oil industry in, of course, the interests of the Iraqi people, but of course, by a wise and beneficent British-based oil company, because of course the Iraqis, bless their hearts, and there has been no such nation as Iraq before, the peoples of the lands of Iraq are still too primitive to learn this, operate this themselves. But of course we will teach them and they will learn. What could possibly go wrong? Well, hold on a moment. I have a quote to read from you. Thank you.
Because this meeting is being recorded.
And I should surely hope so. You can hear me all right again? Can you hear me now? As the saying always goes, I think you can. This is a quote from an article published more than 60 years ago. Originally, it was reprinted in a now all too obscure book, which with an all too obscure title called The Chatham House Version. Matt, of course, and Cynthia know in backwards who Chatham House were and why the book is called this. The Chatham House Version was a collection of essays on the modern political history of the Middle East by the late Professor Eli Kaduri, who died in about 1993 or 1994, who was Professor of Politics at the University of London. And this article, which is reprinted in it, which he originally published in the early 1960s, or actually late 1950s, is called The Kingdom of Iraq, a Retrospect. Brief, and remember, this is not me saying this. This is not one of you saying this. This is one of the leading recognized academic experts in the world of the 20th and 21st centuries, publishing this 60 years ago. Quote begins, "Brief as it is, the record of the Kingdom of Iraq is full of bloodshed, treason, and rapine." He means rape. "And however pitiful its end, we may now say that this was implicit in its beginning." He then goes into detail, which I will leave you to take a look to. The Iraqi kingdom is created by no less than Winston Churchill himself as an imperial fiat at the famous Cairo Conference of 1921. It should be no surprise that his two chief advisors and the chief architects of the Kingdom of Iraq were both dangerous, delusional, egocentric, ignorant idiots. One of them was T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, whose highly entertaining and bizarre personal life we will have cause to explore later in this presentation. The other was Gertrude Bell, again a figure in her own time. She died in the early 1930s, who was regarded as one of the great intellectual, it's rather like Thomas Friedman today, she was regarded as one of the great intellectual towering giants of her time. And she was actually a dangerous, pathetic, ignorant, delusional idiot. They created what is now the land which is now known as Iraq. It never existed as a political entity throughout history before. It was an area which had been fought and refought between the Ottoman Turks and the Persians, who now style themselves Iranians, repeatedly over the previous 2,500 years, at least as far back as 600 BC or BCE, before the Common Era. It had never been a coherent land before. Even its religiosity was in a state of great fluidity. It was dominated overwhelmingly by Arab tribes, the vast majority of whom traditionally had been Sunni Western Muslim, but who only 20 to 30 years before this period, while still under the control of the fearsome Ottoman Turkish Empire, which was almost 400 years old itself, many large numbers of them, creating a majority, while still Arab, had converted to Shiaism, to the Eastern Muslim tradition, for no better or worse reason than because of this, they would then be exempt from having to serve in the Ottoman armies, because the Ottomans did not trust Shiites. And they were bringing in that wonderful Western tradition of universal military conscription. And as Professor Karl Popper's law of unintended consequences, as applied in history, economics, and above all religion applies, this had unexpected consequences which continue to reverberate in the region to this day. To this day. But there was no Iraq. There was no religious unified Iraq. There was no political unified Iraq. There was no unified history of Iraq. Iraq was a fiction of the British Empire originally. Eventually, it became less of that. And indeed, by creating an artificial Iraq from lands, peoples that had nothing in common, that indeed feared and distrusted each other in history, the British, who never had any serious attempt of creating a serious democracy there in the first place, guaranteed that no democracy and unified state of Iraq could be created in the 1990s or in 2003 or by themselves in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Because they were bringing together peoples who had never coexisted together before, who had no experience of developing a consensual, tolerant state or democracy, or even relatively tolerant kingdom, which took, in fact, the Habsburgs hundreds of years to create themselves. And it was never far from perfect even for the Habsburgs. And of course, the British worked overtime to destabilize and eventually smash the Habsburg state, which eventually happened under the power of its own total military incompetence during World War I. So the creation of Iraq starts with Winston Churchill, and it starts with a lie. Why did they do it? For a very simple reason: to gain control of the extraordinary oil riches of the nation, of course. The oil riches in southern Iraq were not yet even suspected in 1921, but the oil riches of the north, around Mosul, the area where the unfortunate Christian Assyrian minority lived at that time, were very well understood indeed. And the strategic importance and priority of this for the British Empire were very well understood in London, and by no one more than Churchill himself. When he created Iraq at the Cairo Conference in 1921, by the fiat of a pen, by a sweeping gesture, working the way he always liked to work best, in total ignorance and drunken incompetence. This was the Churchill style, and it was also his style when he appointed the wrong men to command the British Army in 1942, also on a sweeping visit to Iraq, which we may touch on here as well, because while it has no direct bearing, it has great indirect bearing on Iraq, and it was worked the same Churchill style. Churchill appointed two of the most lazy and incompetent and useless generals in the British Army to defeat Rommel, to replace his previous choice appointments who had been totally catastrophic. He rightly fired for the General Auchinleck, the former commander of the British Army in India, who knew nothing about fighting modern nations like Germany or modern generals like Erwin Rommel whatsoever. And after 18 months of losing battles, despite outnumbering his enemy by 2 or 3 or even 5 to 1, Auchinleck was finally belatedly fired by Churchill, who still invited him. And who did Churchill appoint in his place? General Alexander, who had never won a battle against the Japanese or the Germans, who had only been in charge of bungled retreats, who was lazy and stupid to a phenomenal degree, who to the day he died, Churchill was convinced was the greatest Western general of the war. Wrongly. And he also appointed General William Gott, G-O-T-T, to be the man who would beat and defeat Rommel in the Eighth Army. Gott had never won a battle against Rommel or the Afrika Korps in the 18 months he had been there, and in classic British English loser style was revered by the soldiers who he had led to defeat and 100,000 deaths and casualties in his battles as a divisional and corps commander with total incompetence. He did not have a clue. He knew he did not have a clue. He was so eager to fight Rommel that the very first thing he asked to do when he accepted Churchill's promotion to be the commander of the 8th Army was, "Sir, I would like a few days' leave as I am rather tired before I take field command of the army." This was how eager and energetic Gott was. His first request, with Rommel preparing to conquer the Middle East in a matter of days, not even weeks or months, was, "Can I take a week's leave?" And Churchill, being the drunken, stupid, old asshole that he was, gave him the leave. And this saved Britain, the Middle East, and the world from Nazi conquest. Because the only plane they could find to fly, the 3-star commander of the largest British combat army, was an old, obsolete Bombay transport plane whose rear defensive guns had been removed because it could not fly with balance without of it. This was the state of Royal Air Force Transport Command before the United States Lend-Lease program rescued them in 1942. So the plane was delayed because Gott, as usual, was incompetent and late for his own flight, and thereby signed his own death warrant. Because when the plane took off, a routine flight of 6 Messerschmitt 109s of Rommel's Desert Air Force, of the Luftwaffe, who had no idea who was on the plane, shot it down, and thereby guaranteed German defeat in the war. Because now Churchill was forced to appoint a man he despised and hated, and we will see why he despised and hated him, as commander of the 8th Army. Bernard Montgomery, the greatest British general of the war, and very arguably, probably even more so than the underrated General Omar Bradley, the greatest Western general period of the war, who never lost a battle and who always defeated Rommel every time they clashed over the following 2-year period, and they would clash often and repeatedly. Why did Churchill refuse to appoint Montgomery, who was already the outstanding field combat divisional commander in the British Army, when he brought back the only division still in fighting condition from the fall of France in 1940? It was because a month later, in July 1940, when Montgomery had already been charged with the defense of Britain against overwhelming odds against German invasion, and Churchill visited his command, Montgomery, who was a totaler for the period of the war, though not on principle, had no whiskey to provide the Prime Minister on his visit. And Churchill, of course, was a structural alcoholic all his life. He became bad-tempered, abusive, and childish and irrational when he had no alcohol whatsoever with him. And for this one reason, he refused to appoint Montgomery to field command of the army until his own, the British opposite number for General Marshall, another outstanding commander, who I have often referred to, and you know who I am referring to clearly already, Peter, General Sir Alan Brooke, later General Lord Alan Brooke. But the name slightly changes. This is confusing with British officers, and even supposedly serious American historians mess it up repeatedly every time. But Montgomery was already the outstanding field combat commander in the British Army in 1940. Churchill still refuses to appoint him 2 years later. And even when he is forced to appoint him by his own top army commander, who also despises Churchill, Alan Brooke, Churchill tells the war cabinet back in London and members of his ruling Conservative Party, we have a new general in Cairo. I have just appointed him to command the army. You won't like him very much, which means I don't like him very much. Churchill didn't like him very much. And of course, this is the only man who saves Churchill's drunken ass for the rest of the war. This is the same man who creates Iraq. I go on one of my usual tangents, but I do veer back from it. And I am, as they say in the legal system, laying the foundation for my argument, right? Which is Churchill was already a drunken old ignorant fart in 1921 who listened to assholes. And this is how Iraq and why Iraq was created. And it is the key to what Iraq then becomes. Because throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and he boasts of this in his memoirs, The World Crisis, a magnificent work of turning 20 years of endless catastrophe, bungle, and failure, causing hundreds of thousands of British lives, into an alleged record of triumph, statesmanship, strategy, and achievement. This is how you must understand Churchill's book, The World Crisis. And this is why, when Churchill is asked by his son Randolph during World War II, "Papa, how do you think history is going to treat you?" Churchill replies, "Why, it will treat me very well, of course, for I will write it." And he has already done this before. Evelyn Waugh, the greatest British novelist of the 20th century, a stylist who, at the very least as a stylist, equals Hemingway, and in every other literary important quality and moral quality, vastly exceeds him, recognized this lie. Randolph Churchill, when he was Evelyn Waugh's commanding officer, when they were both serving ineptly and incompetently, but very bravely and touchingly patriotically, supporting the anti-Nazi partisans, communists in fact, Tito's partisans, against the Nazis in Yugoslavia in World War II. Randolph, who reveres his father, although he has terrible relations with him, asks Evelyn Waugh, "What do you think of my father's work of history, Marlborough?" And Waugh immediately replies, "It is the most terrible book, it is a joke." Stylistically, it is a very weak recasting of the already bankrupt writing style of Macaulay 100 years ago. And as history, it is, of course, worthless. This was true of all Churchill's histories, which are still revered, especially by neoconservatives and US policymakers to this day, which is why they have aphasia over the history of Iraq and they have never read anything about the true history of Iraq. Well, we have Kaduri's summary, and he is writing after a 37-year period of the Kingdom of Iraq under British control has just been bloodily ended by the Iraqi army and the Iraqi people themselves in 1958, to the vast rejoicing of the Iraqi people. And before we go back to the Cairo Conference of 1921, where Iraq begins, we actually need to look at the end of it all, 1958, where the Kingdom of Iraq ends in a totally different Iraq. And not a happy Iraq either, a bloody, repressed Iraq. But why did the Iraqi people put up with all that bloodshed and repression in later years? And why were they paranoid about first British and then, most of all, American intervention in Iraq? Because they knew and had endured, and their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had endured, what the enlightened British rule of Iraq from 1921 to 1958 was. And if the American people and if the peoples of the West had known anything about the history of Iraq from 1921 to 1958 under Britain, then the neocons could never have sold the ridiculous lie that they were going to create for the very first time a stable pro-American balanced democracy with happiness for all in Iraq in 1948. Nathan, I see you see the central point. Bless you, you have grasped it immediately. Because from 1921 to 1958, the oil of Iraq, first around Mosul, and then other enormous quantities of oil being found at the other end of Iraq, of course, from the extension of the great Kuwaiti and United Arab Emirates and Saudi and Dhahran oil fields around the Persian Gulf. All of these oil fields were and remained almost to today the most by far the largest, best quality, and also most easily accessible and cheaply taken out oil fields on Earth. China now has very friendly relations with both, to develop these oil fields with both Iraq and Iran. So does India. They obviously need them. China's need for oil fields, oil is so great, of course, that they have gone a very different route from the British. They have not sought to conquer and destroy or even artificially create entire nations and enslave entire or exterminate entire populations as the British Empire did to develop their oil. They have not gone for the cheapest and easiest access oil in the world. They actually have, but under legitimate open financial and commercial agreements with the nations in question, which are Iran, Iraq, and now also Saudi Arabia, which as we speak is turning from being under American de facto control for the past 70, 75 years to being under Chinese and Russian protection, because Saudi Arabia is now looking to join its arch rival, which it most fears, Iran, in the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, not NATO, the SCO is the most powerful, wealthiest, military alliance in the world, with the largest industrial base, the largest thermonuclear arsenal, the most modern thermonuclear arsenal, the most modern strike forces in both China and Russia, not the United States. We have isolated ourselves, and of course, we continue to do so. But all of this goes back to the original lie, to Churchill's crime of 1921. He goes to the Cairo conference, and as he boasts afterwards, I created 3 nations at the drop of a hat. What were the nations? Iraq was one. And Iraq had to be artificially created to ensure British control of the oil, because Britain was still the dominant global power, controlling a quarter of the population of the world and a quarter of the territories and natural resources of the world. And it had by far the dominant naval force in the world, though that was about to change from a direction Churchill was totally blind to. Because the very next year, in 1923, the Harding administration, spearheaded by President Warren Harding and his enormously underestimated and enormously powerful, brilliant, successful, and important Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, host together the Washington Naval Conference. And the Washington Naval Conference forces the British Empire to accept parity with the United States in global naval power, which they wrongly define as battleships. And in fact, in the real force of naval power, which is aircraft carriers, the United States immediately outstrips Britain, because the British naval strategists and chiefs, led by Churchill himself, are totally ignorant and asshole blind and incompetent to the importance of aircraft carriers, even though General Billy Mitchell in 1921 is already sinking capital ships successfully using biplanes. He sinks battleships and battle cruisers taken over from the defeated German Imperial Navy, just to show what battleships and aircraft carriers can do. And the generals of the US Army, led by Douglas MacArthur, are blind to this. They're idiots. They don't want to know, they don't want to see the future, and they are ignorant of it. But the admirals of the United States Navy, who have been personally selected and raised up during World War I by the de facto political head of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who served as Assistant Secretary of State for the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but de facto ran the Navy because his boss was an agreeable old drunken politico who liked his bottle of Jack Daniels and was lazy, and therefore let Roosevelt run and build the modern United States Navy through World War I. Now, in the Churchill myth, we know that Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty for 4 years. I have given a previous lecture here, which Matt has pasted up and is available on YouTube, on Churchill as a strategic incompetent who lost more than 10,000 British sailors through his own total incompetence, through building the wrong kind of warships and leaving them utterly vulnerable to attack in World War I, not just in World War II, and who also lost at least 3 fleets of warships to German submarine and cruiser action in World War I because he was too stupid to deploy them properly and would not listen to his admirals who warned him in advance. And his record in World War II until the United States rescued him was even worse, when 1/3 of the British Navy's capital ships were lost to largely avoidable enemy action. 30% of them, 1 in 3, were sunk directly because of stupid deployments and orders which Churchill made, overriding his own admirals. And this ends for 2 reasons. First, because effective control of the overall war is taken over by Roosevelt and the joint Anglo-American Chiefs of Staff operating out of Washington in World War II in 1942, where Churchill can no longer bully them and bungle them. And secondly, because after Churchill's own chosen buddy drinking partner, a gallant fighting sailor in his day, but by World War II, a man already dying from a brain tumor, and therefore Churchill's favorite brain to run the war, a man dying from a brain tumor, Admiral Dudley Pound, dies virtually in office, and is replaced for the last 2.5 years of the war by one of the great British fighting admirals of the war who Churchill hates, Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, ABC as he is known, who is a poor coalition partner for the Allies in organizing the invasions of Sicily and Italy. That isn't really what he's good at, but he's good at sinking Italian warships. And he's good as keeping his nerve when under Churchill's orders the entire Mediterranean fleet is sunk by German air attack, a threat which Cunningham warned them about and Churchill ignored at the Battle of Crete in May 1941. May 1941. So this is the same man, again in the Middle East, again fucking up everything. At the Cairo Conference of 1921, he creates 3 nations from scratch. He creates what effectively become modern Israel and Jordan, but they succeed because they eventually come under the control of people who he never intended to run them. He does get his own chosen favorite, Emir Faisal, to create a Hashemite dynasty in Iraq. He likes Faisal for the same reason he liked all the loser generals who he promoted in World War II. Alexander, Gott, Cunningham, Ritchie. These are all agreeable to Churchill because they are tall and handsome and stupid. And they simply say yes, sir, to him. Alexander is a bit more shrewd than that because Alexander is a terrible fighting general, has no brains, is lazy, doesn't have a clue, but he has a very significant EQ, emotional quotient. He knows how to lick the ass of both Dwight Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander and also, more importantly, of Churchill himself. And he's actually of use to Montgomery because he has just enough brains to realize that Montgomery, who had taught him at War College, who was senior to Alexander in experience and intellect and competence in every possible way, was capable of winning battles where he himself was not. So as long as Montgomery commands fighting forces in the Mediterranean, the Allies win. The 8th Army smashes Rommel. It drives 2,000 miles west in record time, drives the Germans out of North Africa, rescues the American army when the American army's own commanders, led by Eisenhower, are too either green and as yet inexperienced, which was the case with Bradley and Patton, but more usually when they were Eisenhower and Marshall's personal choices, they were worthless assholes who didn't have a clue. Like Mark Clark, Friedenhall, who loses at Kasserine, and every other commander who is all Marshall's carefully chosen favorites in North Africa. They stall in front of Tunis for 5 months, while Montgomery drives 2,000 miles west to rescue them. And yet Eisenhower, after the war and during the war, successfully spreads the lie that Montgomery is a cautious general who's always frightened to attack and is too cautious, when he's the loser, he's the asshole. When Eisenhower demotes Montgomery in 1944 on the Western Front, our old friend General Allenbrook, the head of the British Army, has one reaction. This means the war is going to last for another 6 to 9 months into the spring and summer of 1944 because Eisenhower doesn't have a clue. And of course, he is absolutely correct. And of course, Eisenhower knows how to stand up to Churchill, who was actually rather scared of him. Churchill is such a loser that in 1955, he tries to undermine Eisenhower by getting Truman to come out of retirement to run for president in 1956. Now, there are a lot of negative things to be said about Harry Truman, but politically, he was not a fool. He had a head on his head. And even as a fighting soldier, he had more experience and was much more impressive than Eisenhower. And both of them recognize this. So Truman has enough good sense not to take Churchill seriously. But of course, Truman has already seen through Churchill. In 1947, Truman accompanies Churchill to make the famous Iron Curtain speech at Fulton, Missouri. And they play cards together. Now, of course, Churchill is a lifelong gambler. And he loses at every game he ever plays. And Truman has to give his own staff strict instructions to lose to Churchill so as to not to humiliate the old boy too much. That is the kind of genius we are dealing with. He puts Emir Faisal in charge of Iraq. Actually, he has bigger plans for Faisal. Churchill's plans were, as Secretary of State for the colonies, to make Faisal the king of all the Arabs, just as he is going to make Chaim Weizmann the head of the Zionist movement and the king of the Jews, and they will then make a peace together. This is Churchill's vision. And Weizmann and Jewish money will develop the Middle East under the wise leadership of Faisal. Never going to happen, of course. First, the Jews in Palestine loathe Weizmann and never accept him as their leader, and rightly so, because Weizmann's only gift is to be a front for the British Empire and to flatter British leaders like Balfour and Churchill. And Faisal has the same gift from the Arabs, but Faisal's own father has been the religious curator of the holy sites all his life, a hereditary position, he did not earn it, in Mecca and Medina, and he is loathed by the peoples of Arabia. They instead rally against the British, not for the British, for their own national leader who respects their religious culture, who respects traditional Arab democracy under the Majlis system of consultation of leaders of different clans and sub-clans, with leaders whom they themselves choose and appoint, who are appointed and recognized on the basis of merit and military victory and competence and generosity and respect for the opinion of others. Does that sound more like a realistic democracy for you? But it's traditional Arab culture. So as far as the British were concerned, it couldn't be a legitimate political system at all. And that's what Churchill felt. But the Arabs' own choice for their leader is a charismatic young, and in his day very slim and dashing, though as he gets older and wealthy, he never loses his wisdom or his shrewdness or his brilliant military capabilities or political abilities. He is the real leader of the real Arab national awakening in the Middle East. And his name is Abdulaziz ibn Saud. He is the founder of Saudi Arabia, which is named after him. And Churchill rejects him as the leader of the Arabs. And by 1925, with all the does this sound familiar? The United States has all its air force and power, and it cannot stop the Taliban from humiliating it and kicking its worthless puppets out of Tehran, out of Afghanistan, out of Iran. Has this happened in recent times? Would our worthless puppets in Iraq also have fallen unless Obama, in panic, poured the army back in 2014 after the Islamic State had taken over half the country, because even the Islamic State was preferable to the people of Iraq than the totally corrupt, contemptible American puppets who we had put in charge. It had all happened before and in the same places and right beside them. Winston Churchill still deploys the largest navy in human history in 1925, when he is the second as Chancellor of the Exchequer or Finance Minister, which he then is. He is still the #2 man in the British government of Stanley Baldwin. The settlement of Saudi Arabia, which he has brilliantly planned to be run by King Faisal in Iraq, and by his father, King Faisal's father, and by their whole Hashemite dynasty, has just been swept away and repudiated by the peoples of Arabia themselves, who turn instead to not Sharif Hussein, but to Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founding father of Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is a legitimate nation state created by the national uprising and cohesive coming together of its peoples in kicking out the greatest imperialists of them all, the British, from 1922 to 1925, when Churchill was driving the British. And not all the firepower deployed to threaten them in the Red Sea by the Royal Navy of the British Empire can stop it. Can stop them. And that is how Saudi Arabia was formed. So Saudi Arabia still survives as a powerful, legitimate, cohesive nation, even when it is now in the throes of throwing off 80 years of American control, which at first they eagerly accepted because it meant they were free of the British. They were free of the British. And King Abdulaziz ibn Saud accepts as his closest friend and top political advisor as early as the 1920s an extraordinary individual, an Englishman who was a former civil servant, but he is not a tool of the British Empire. He has come to despise and reject the British Empire and vomit it out. His name is St. John Philby. He converts to Islam. And for the rest of his life, he is the top political advisor and closest personal friend of King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, who holds him in the greatest honor to the day he dies. And St. John Philby has a son who, because his best friend, the King of Saudi Arabia, has made him a wealthy man after he was forced to resign in disgrace from the colonial office because he dared to tell him that they were backing contemptible losers in the Middle East, and that the dynasty, which was Churchill's pride and joy, would never succeed in Iraq or anywhere else, as they did not. Because of that, he can afford to send his son to the best schools in England and then to Cambridge University. But his son has the same contempt for the British Empire as the father does. And the son, of course, then joins the British Secret Service, determined to destroy the British Empire from within, which he contributes greatly to doing. He is the famous traitor Philby, who eventually ends his life in the Soviet Union, in Moscow, who becomes one of the, just as his father became one of the greatest heroes and influential figures advising the government of Saudi Arabia, the son becomes one of the most influential figures advising the Soviet Union in how to bring down the British Empire. When Malcolm Muggeridge, who was a drinking buddy of the son when they were both in the British Secret Service in World War II, interviews David Ben-Gurion, founding father of Israel, about the bizarre Philbys, father and son. He asks Ben-Gurion, what did you make of Philby, the son, and the fact that he betrayed the British Empire and the British Secret Service, and of course the CIA, to the KGB and to Stalin and to Stalin's successors? And Ben-Gurion isn't surprised at all. Ben-Gurion tells Muggeridge, no one should have been surprised. The father was an English traitor who became a Muslim. So the son was an English traitor who became a communist. What's the shock in that? Ben-Gurion, you see, had not been trained at either Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge, so he had a very unsophisticated mind. My own Oxford mentor, Isaiah Berlin, never liked him. Berlin was offered repeatedly the greatest honors and jobs in both Israel and Britain by leaders he didn't like or privately, personally loathed, but couldn't afford to say so. Margaret Thatcher wanted to put him in the House of Lords, and he'd accepted the knighthood earlier, and he always felt awkward about even that because he was a man of the left. And so, although he revered the British royal family like all English Jews, he was more of a snob even than any traditional Englishman ever was, right? But he loathed Mrs. Thatcher, yet she admired him and took a lot of her political ideas from him. So I think there is a great comic play or novel still to be written about the relationship and exchanges between Isaiah Berlin and Mrs. Thatcher, because it was such a hilarious comedy of errors. They misread each other totally. But before that, Berlin did respect David Ben-Gurion, but he didn't like him. He wasn't comfortable with him. And the reason that Berlin always gives in his private conversations and in his letters about this is, Ben-Gurion reminded me of Nikita Khrushchev, not in his political allegiances or his political values, but in the kind of man he was. They both gave you the impression that they were very unintellectual figures, and I didn't like that. And they both had great political shrewdness and cunning. And of course, Berlin, if you look at the politicians Berlin was actually personally close to in Britain, well, he admired FDR from a distance, though he didn't know him personally, but he admired him enormously. But the two figures who he most revered personally and was proud of being close to socially were two foreign secretaries of Britain. Anthony Eden, who was one of the great architects of British imperial control of the Arab Middle East and was a loser and screwed it all up. And of all people, the man who gave India his freedom, which Berlin did approve of, but who was also the arch-appeaser, Lord Halifax. He is known as Lord Irwin when he was Viceroy of India, and by the time he becomes Foreign Secretary in 1938, he is Lord Halifax. So Americans who are ignorant of the British class system and the British title system don't even realize they're dealing with a different man. They're just ignorant of it. They haven't done their homework. They haven't read it up. And yet this mistake is universally made even by so-called serious historians in the United States to this day. But those are the people Berlin likes, when their political record is actually extremely unimpressive. Eden, of course, becomes Churchill's heir and works under Churchill from 1940 to 1955-56 tirelessly to keep the Middle East under Britain's imperial thumb. He struggles to keep Churchill's plan of the Middle East under control. Now remember, Churchill's plan was not the state of Israel that came into existence, and it was not the kingdom of Jordan we see today as it evolved. Churchill has two hand-picked individuals to run the Middle East, and neither of them can do it. There is Weizmann, who was always the figurehead of the Zionist movement in London, and the British are such deeply dyed imperialists that they cannot believe that the Jews can possibly run themselves or make a success or run themselves without being run from London by Weizmann, who in turn always agrees with everything the British tell him to agree with. That's how dim and how stupid and how ignorant the British are. And they're even worse when it comes to the Arabs, because they create the fantasy of T.E. Lawrence, creating this great British-run Arab revolt led by the Emir Faisal. And this is the conventional wisdom you see in the movie Lawrence of Arabia, with Peter O'Toole. Now, the movie was made by David Keane, who is a brilliant, has no political brains in his head whatsoever, but was a brilliant atmospheric movie maker. When you look at at Lawrence of Arabia, especially on a giant modern screen or a 70-inch TV, the immensity and physical reality of the deep desert of Arabia is created and recreated in ways that are totally convincing. And he pulls the same trick off in Dr. Zhivago, even though, as my Ukrainian wife never tires of pointing out, she is disgusted by the movie, although actually it's beautifully cast and acted, but none of the cast of actors are Russian or Ukrainian or Slavs at all. You have Omar Sharif, who is Egyptian and a great actor and a great movie craftsman. And he does the best job anyone can possibly do as Boris Pasternak's self-portrait. He himself was a great poet, of course, as Andrei Zhivago, as the great beloved romantic poet. And all the actresses are beautiful, impeccable English actresses. Ironically enough, the most acclaimed English Shakespearean actress of her generation, and happily still very with us, was from a Russian aristocratic background. Helen Mirren, who is most of all famous for playing hard-boiled British detective senior officers, which may not be that far from being a successful Russian aristocrat in the 19th century when you think about it. But her original name was Mironovich. Her family were Russian aristocrats who fled to escape the revolution. And her father took a job and raised her simply driving taxis in London. But Helen Mirren's, of course, own astounding beauty, intellect, talent, and gift for any language, including English, brings her up. So she became one of the definitive British actresses and movie stars of her generation anyway. But she wasn't cast in she would have been too young anyway at that time, obviously. But what David Lean does in Dr. Zhivago is also what he does in Lawrence of Arabia. He creates what a Jewish grandmother would have called in Yiddish a Baba Maisa, a grandmother's fairy tale, favorable for children before the age of 4, before they start to read. At the time of 5 or 6, kids are already too sophisticated to believe in British fairy tales, especially about Lawrence of Arabia. The real Lawrence of Arabia was a very minor, unsuccessful academic with a gift for flattering his bosses, who gets sucked into the British intelligence service under Sir Gilbert Clayton, the British Intelligence Bureau, the Arab Bureau as it's then called, in Cairo, because he can read a few words of cuneiform and speak about half a dozen words of Arabic. He knows more than all the experts do, all the British experts do. The level of ignorance, arrogance, and incompetence among these people defies belief. And he never goes beyond that. And he is sent out and he bribes the most corrupt, despicable, unpopular, incompetent leaders in Arabia, which means the Sharif family, who are going nowhere and are loathed by the Arab peoples of Arabia, as I mentioned before, and they lead the Arab revolt. And then he does what General Petraeus does to tame the so-called revolt, his military, the same reason for the victory in rolling back or stopping ISIS conquering anybody else in 2014. No, not even that, for stabilizing the surge in 2005, for which Petraeus is regarded by the neocons and by Victor David Hanson as a military genius greater than MacArthur, greater than Patton, greater than Montgomery, greater than anyone, right? And of course, how long does this brilliant military victory last? Until the rise of ISIS in 2014, because of what has Petraeus actually done? He's defeated nobody. He's solved no political problems. He's won no military victories whatsoever. He has spent money. He has bribed the tribes, and he has bribed even half of ISIS not to bother going on any further for the moment. And it was the same as what we did in Afghanistan. And as soon as the money spigot was turned off in Afghanistan, all the forces that the United States and the Biden administration believed it had taught the virtues of democracy automatically trying to go over to the Taliban immediately. And a Taliban victory, which by every think tank in Washington predicted would not happen for 9 to 12 months, if at all, probably not ever, takes place in the space of 2 weeks. And even in my old age, I predicted that in political analyses I was publishing in Moscow at the time, because I was not allowed to publish them in Washington. And what was the great source that I had, the great secret source? It was the United States government itself. It was the only honest source in the United States government. SIGAR, SIGAR, AR, the Special Inspector in the Department of Defense on Afghanistan Relations or Development, SIGAR, and as early as March and April when was it, 2017? 2018, I've even forgotten the year already, but the year that Kabul falls. And the United States Air Force has to rescue 120,000 terrified people who were stupid enough to believe the US armed forces, and more especially the Biden administration, were competent enough to protect them. And the neocons were wise and had created a force which would last for generations. It was the same as with Churchill. You bribe, you buy, and as long as you spend and you bribe, you have their loyalty. But the people who matter, the nationalists, the patriots, the religiously inspired people, will follow genuine leaders, good or bad. But they will not follow the bribery and lies of the British Empire, and therefore they did not follow the lies of the American Empire either. And this was true about T.E. Lawrence's mythical revolt in 1916 to 1918, which was non-existent. And the British were not even using it to debar the Arabs. They had such contempt for the Arabs, they thought the Arabs loved them, and the Arabs would want to be led by them through eternity. No. The British, far-seeing as always, saw that the real threat to their power in the Middle East was France, which was going to take over Syria as it did. And they wanted to keep France out of, and Turkey, of course, too, out of the northern Iraqi, as we call them now, the Mosul oil fields. So they invented the fiction of the nation of Iraq and of being the champions of Arab nationalism in order to get control of the oil, to keep the Royal Navy the most powerful force on earth. And this was why under Churchill, back in 1911 and 1912, the British abandoned 120 years of support for the Turkish Ottoman Empire. They had supported the Ottoman Empire when it was slaughtering Christians by the hundreds of thousands in the Balkans throughout the 1870s. That was Disraeli's policy, and it was Lord Salisbury's policy. And they happily supported the Jewish Prime Minister of Imperial Victorian England supported the Muslim Empire 100%, and neither the Turkish caliphs in Constantinople nor the Queen Empress, and he gave her the title of Queen Empress. Churchill greatly admired Disraeli because they were both bullshit artists, of course. They both reveled in empire, except Disraeli was a lot more competent and a much more significant force for at least keeping peace in Europe than Churchill ever was. But by 1911, the British Navy, as I have said in previous lectures, is switching from 50 or 60 years of reliance on coal and sail power for hundreds of years before that, all over to oil. It is the only way they believe correctly they can maintain naval dominance over the Germans in the North Sea. They don't care about America. Churchill, after all, is half American himself and is blind to the American challenge, though other imperial leaders in London are most definitely not. But you have to have oil, and that is why the British seize the oil of Persia, of Iran, and create the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company with the Royal Navy and Churchill and the British government as its biggest shareholder and financial supporter and capital provider in 1911. But that automatically leads them to the oil of northern Iraq as well, and they are determined to get it. And they don't believe there's any oil in Saudi Arabia. But Churchill has a plan for Saudi Arabia anyway, to put Emir Faisal, a dreamy, lazy, charming young man, very like, as I said, his military favorites of World War II, very like Earl Alexander, very good at flattering Churchill and useless at anything else, just as Chaim Weizmann is among the Zionists. And these are Churchill's solutions for Britain to rule the Middle East forever. There will be a Zionist-controlled Palestine, but only under Chaim Weizmann, and he has no conception that any rival forms of Zionism, either from the right under Vladimir Jabotinsky, or the eventual successors, which is social democratic Zionism under David Ben-Gurion, can possibly emerge there. Why should they? Because these are just peasants. And Weizmann is a cultivated man and a scientist and a genius, and he knows how to wear suits and how to get his beard barbered before every public appearance, which of course I did not do before this lecture. Well, hopefully you will be more broad-minded and intelligent than Churchill could ever be, and forgive me for that. But that was Churchill's solution, and it fails on every account. There is already independent political movements under both the right and left emerging in a genuinely democratic Palestine, to the bewilderment of the British and their great disapproval as early as the mid-1920s. All the Polish Jews who were supposed to come under either Jabotinsky or Weizmann in the 1920s do not leave Poland. First, because when they're Orthodox and pious and religious, their own rabbis are too stupid to realize the danger that is looming in Europe and tell them to stay. They hate Zionism, which is a secular force, like poison. The rabbis hate Zionism and fight it bitterly. A rabbi with the bizarre title of the Hafetz Chaim, which means the desire from life. And he was actually a very ugly little bizarre dwarf, 4'9" tall. Almost no photographs of him exist because he is a Kabbalist and he is terrified that any photograph will take a part of his soul away. And he also orders that no lights be allowed, no electric lighting be allowed in any synagogue, despite the dangers of fire from it, even on weekdays. You can't even let lights on the Sabbath, but you mustn't have electric lighting in there all through the week. This horrible, bizarre little creature says that the Zionists are modern Amalekites and they are more evil and dangerous to the Jews than the communists or the Nazis. That is the kind of enlightened political leadership that led 2 million Orthodox Jews to their deaths and their doom in both world wars. And then, of course, their succeeders after the war blame the left-wing Zionists under Ben-Gurion for failing to rescue them, when Ben-Gurion and his associates had been pleading with their leaders in vain to come and escape to either America or Palestine, while they still had the chance to in the 1920s and 1930s. Churchill is blind to all of this, of course, but in the Middle East, as I say, he is even more blind. The only place he succeeds in putting his leaders, and let us get to the specifics of it, Iraq, is Iraq. And what is the political record of Iraq? Which, remember, the British vow solemnly in 1922 to the League of Nations, and in 1923 in formal treaties they sign and claim to honor. They are going to create an independent nation in Iraq. It is going to be democratic. It is going to be tolerant to all minorities. It is going to have free and fair elections. It is going to raise the standards of the Iraqi people. Needless to say, over the next 35 years, from 1923, when the treaty was signed, to 1958, it does none of those things. Almost all the oil wealth which is energetically developed in the Mosul region by the British is then pumped out through Palestine. That's what they need Palestine for. The pipeline is built through Syria and or through northern Jordan. Jordan is safely under British control, and the French can't afford, are terrified still of Germany, so they can't afford to defy the British. But they've been squeezed out of the oil wealth of the Middle East by the British. They are the traditional enemy the British are still concerned about. The British have beaten the Germans. They're obsessed with keeping out the French. They never dream America is going to take it all from them eventually, which they do. Of course, as early as the 1930s, significant oil finds have already been made by highly competent American oil companies that have been brought in on the advice of St. John Philby, advising his bosom friend and master, the new king and creator of Saudi Arabia, a very shrewd fellow. And by 1945, the oil wealth of Saudi Arabia is already significantly powerful enough for President Franklin Roosevelt to outrage the British by bringing in the King of Saudi Arabia, who has kept out of World War II very ostensibly and very clearly. He will work with the Americans, but like the Irish nationalists before him, he will not work with the British because he knows them too well. And he knows what they're after, and he still fears and respects them and knows they are capable of a comeback. This is why Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir and their two terrorist guerrilla organizations have to bomb the British out of Palestine after World War II. Because although the Attlee government, with its foreign and security policies dominated by Ernest Bevin, although they will go along with and even welcome in their own ways the granting of full independence to India, they are idealistic enough for that, even though under Lord Mountbatten, the late Queen's uncle, they totally and catastrophically bungle. And it's a British responsibility throughout. At least 3 million people, possibly 5 million people, are killed in the partition of India between Pakistan and India. And the end result is two thermonuclear superpowers who hate each other to this day. Except today, once again, we find where the British failed and the Americans were incompetent and ignorant, Russia and China have to step in to fill the gap. Because who mediates today between India and Pakistan? The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of course, which means China and Russia working in partnership. Yet again, they have to move in to clean up the mess the British created 100 years ago and left when they were kicked out of the region 60 and 70 years ago. It is the same ghastly, miserable story. Iraq is a subsection of this. The British set up as the longest prime minister of Iraq. There are 3 kings in Iraq who rule in Iraq from 1921 to 1958. The British are fond of kings. They love to lecture America on how pure republics are not stable forms of government and how constitutional democracies, which are never, of course, if they are kingdoms, they are never remotely as constitutional or as democratic as they are presented to the world to be. And Iraq fits that model. King Faisal does try to protect a free press at first in Iraq. At first, it's too free for his taste, and then something even more dangerous happens after 1930. The king, who likes the good life, likes to spend a lot of time in France and in Switzerland, where the British cannot control the newspapers he reads and the information coming to him. And he starts to read more dissident journalists from his own country. And he finds he agrees with them about the British. King Faisal wants to completely eliminate British political control over Iraq. And so, like President Warren Harding before him and the Vice President of the United States in 1899, he develops a convenient illness, and after a few months he dies tragically, not even in his own country, but in Iraq, with the breast of British medical corps vainly trying to save his life, of course, at the time. The idea that King Faisal was poisoned and assassinated by his British controllers has never been acknowledged by a single British-based historian of the Middle East. And yet it was openly discussed and accused of and debated at the time. And the British, not the Iraqis, but the British sought to repress this coverage and open debate as early as the 1930s. King Ghazi, warrior name, the son of King Faisal, takes over from his tragically dead father. He likes to drive 5 fast cars, but otherwise he's a well-meaning, harmless young man. There is a tragic car accident in 1938, just after the king is trying to establish independent foreign relations with Germany, and most especially with Italy, which would welcome the move and move out from being solely under control again of the British. Who does that leave? It leaves a 5-year-old boy, King Faisal II, a sweet, well-meaning, harmless lad, but he is totally under British imperial control and will remain so for the rest of his life. So we have 2 de facto regicides in the political history of Iraq, which shaped the entire political destination of the nation for the remaining period of the 35 years. It is under full British control. The real power in Iraq lies with a man who no scholar, no so-called expert on the Middle East in any of the useless think tanks of Washington or in any State Department of any administration, Republican or Democrat, I have come across, has ever been remotely familiar with. He is known and remembered all too well in Iraq by the Iraqi people themselves. His name is Nuri Said. S-A apostrophe I or A-D, Nuri al-Said. He is a very familiar figure to today. He is a former Ottoman army, relatively loyal, patriotic officer before World War I, who serves with them against the British in World War I, but he sees the way the wind is blowing and he signs on with the British. And he becomes the longest serving leader in the history of Iraq till Saddam Hussein himself. Because of the technicalities of a theoretical constitutional parliamentary system, there are a number of periods of time when he steps down for a few months, but the British always bring him back. And from 1918, when he is an advisor to the British military authorities, through the 1920s, when he is already established by the British, although Faisal never wants him, as the Prime Minister of Iraq, all the way through to 1958, he is the real ruler of Iraq. He is forced to flee for his life on 3 separate occasions, because the wonderful democracy that Churchill created in Iraq is toppled by the Iraqi army on 3 separate coups. First in 1936, to great popular acclaim, but the British still have total control of the country and re-establish themselves immediately. Then in 1941, when the British actually have to go to the bother of invading and reconquering Iraq, using Palestine as their base because no more local or nearer Arab country will allow the British to re-establish their dominance over Iraq, not even Jordan, where there is another strand, the only competent strand of the Hashemite family, because Churchill didn't like them. And they produced 3 first-class and highly competent and responsible and popular rulers in Jordan, to this, the third of whom, King Abdullah II, rules there to this day. Because as with Montgomery, the people who stand up to Churchill and he cannot stand are the only competent people in town who have to be called in to save their countries when Churchill himself has fucked everything up. This happened in the Western Desert, which is why I started there in 1942. It happened in 1921 in Transjordan, where the Emir Abdullah, the brother of Churchill's favorite, King Faisal of Iraq, takes over. And he tries to actually make a genuine peace with the Jewish Zionists who are taking over in Palestine in 1947 to prevent a bloody war breaking out. But 2 people prevent him making a genuine peace with and looking after the genuine interests of the Palestinian people in the land of Israel. The first of them is Israel's answer to Churchill. Again, another enormous popular hero in America who is a worthless piece of shit. Golda Meir. Golda Meir. Ben-Gurion makes one of his few mistakes in sending her to negotiate with Emir Faisal in 1947, and she fucks it all up. Immediately afterwards, she will do the same thing when, again, for domestic political reasons, Ben-Gurion sends her as the first and for that time last Israeli ambassador to the Soviet Union. And she so outrages Stalin and kicks up his paranoia that he kicks her out and then switches the Soviet Union 100% to the Arab camp, where it remains for the next 40 years until the perestroika era of Mikhail Gorbachev. Because she is a useless idiot. And later on, she will repeat the same mistake towards the United States. She thinks that Israeli relations with the United States are not important and sends the Israeli general who prepared the Israeli army for the Six-Day War, whom she despises, of course, Yitzhak Rabin, to be the ambassador to the United States in 1968, because she thinks it's an obscure position which has never mattered to anyone. And of course, Rabin then becomes the architect of the US-Israeli special relationship, because the generals in the Pentagon, who hold him in the highest regard because the Israeli army won the Six-Day War, even though he had nothing actually to do with that. Again, it's a comedy of errors. He gets the credit. He actually has a nervous breakdown and melts down and is totally useless the week before the war. And General Moshe Dayan, the outstanding military and diplomatic architect of modern Israel, is brought back to stabilize command and command the war and save the day, which he does. And in fact, Ben Gurion himself always despised and distrusted Rabin for very entertaining reasons, which reflect very well actually on Ben Gurion and very badly on Rabin. But we can, in some ways badly on Rabin, which we can get to on the side, but it would be yet another distraction from this, which is Iraq. Why the British created it, why it was a catastrophic state for so long, and why it was an artificial state for so long, and why Churchill's model of original creating Israel to serve under the Arabs, not as an independent Jewish state as the Jews imagined, but to serve the Arabs as part of the grand British command control of the Middle East, also totally failed and was a dead letter long before even Iraq became a dead letter. But the British at first could not allow Iraq to become a dead letter. They needed the oil. And they needed it to appear that Emir King Faisal was a success in Baghdad and that the Iraqi people loved him. They eventually came to respect him, especially after he was murdered by the British and the British covered up his murder, and especially after his own son was then murdered by the British and the British covered up that too. So there was a belated success in this, but rightly, the Iraqi people always saw the monarchy as a British tool, and Nuri Said was their real ruler. He was their Saddam Hussein, or he was their American puppet, you could say, in Baghdad, until 1958, when the Iraqi army had had enough of it, and they revolted again, and they killed the king. And they killed his sisters, and they killed his mother, and they killed his aunties, and they killed his uncles. And they also killed, because they weren't going to make the same mistake of allowing another heir for the British to be put on the throne. And General Qasim, who did not want the royal family executed, but it was done in his coup, becomes a national popular hero. Much more popular than Saddam Hussein ever was, because he has kicked the British out of Iraq. But it is Nuri al-Said who, for the third time, has to flee from his own country's army. He flees typically disguised as a woman, the most shameful disguise in Arab and Muslim and Middle Eastern culture you could possibly adopt. He flees as a coward without honor. Exactly what you would expect of the great statesman who the British put in charge of their oil, the nation they artificially created for 37 years. He is identified in the street. A crowd, he is shot on the spot and then quickly buried, but this is not enough for the Iraqi people to take out 40 years of frustration and rage against him. The body the very next day is dug up, and nothing of Nuri is left to bury. He is literally stamped into pulp by the mob in a Baghdad street. This is what 40 years of enlightened British statesmanship and democracy has taught to the Iraqi people. But the Iraqi people are not like this. They were taught it by the British over a 40-year period. What else happened during that 40-year period before we close? As I say, there were 3 military coups. There was the use by the British-controlled puppet government in Baghdad of the Iraqi army to exterminate entire tribes. The Christian Assyrian minority which had enjoyed full freedom of religion and protection for 400 years under the Ottoman Turkish Empire, is exterminated in the 1930s, and Germany, still democratic at the time in the Weimar Republic, leads an effort to condemn Britain for permitting genocide in Iraq against a Christian minority. And it takes all the bribery and corruption and diplomatic cunning of the British to stave this off in 1931 and 1932. But it is Germany that tries to reveal the hypocrisy of genocide of a Christian minority under British control in Iraq. In 1941, when the British are reconquering Iraq from the second military coup, and Kaduri writes about this, he was actually an eyewitness of it as a 15-year-old boy at the time, the British deliberately stop their army outside Baghdad to allow the army to carry out its only successful military operation in the failed coup. The rape and pillage of the Jewish community in Iraq, in which at least 1,000 Jewish women in the Iraqi Jewish community are raped, and many of whom are killed. The death toll runs into the high hundreds. Officially, of course, it was placed as far lower. But the British prevent their own army from occupying Baghdad sooner in order to maintain the fiction that they are going in as popular forces of law and order, and in order to do what they have done before, which is to cynically offer up Iraqi Jews to Arab mobs as scapegoats. This is what the British own respect for law and order in Iraq amounted to. Now, the Iraqi people were well familiar with this disgusting and miserable record. But for some strange reason, the American influence in Iraq since occupation in 2003 has been at best utterly incompetent and piss-ignorant, which is, given the American academic and political and military record in the Middle East, the most likely and realistic of explanations anyway. Or they have cynically suppressed it. The British have certainly cynically suppressed it. The Americans, who the British intellectuals, of course, privately continue to despise, were too ignorant and piss-ignorant of this. I'll throw it in here, by the way, a throwaway from one of the finest British writers of the 20th century, who's just died, the great spy novelist John le Carré. In his novel, The Honorary Schoolboy, the all-powerful mighty CIA, the British Secret Service, impoverished, incompetent, and until recently totally infiltrated and controlled by the Soviets as usual, is desperate to get back into the CIA's good graces. But far from controlling the CIA at that time, they are so insecure and desperate to flatter the Americans, and yet have such contempt for them at the same time, that they bring the visiting CIA chiefs in London to old British clubs like White's, where they give them inferior Claret and Rosé, very poor and incompetent wines, because they rightly judge that the British will be flattered to be brought by the clubs, but are too ignorant of drinking good quality French wines to know the difference between them and British trash anyway. And that really is the attitude of the British ruling classes to this day, as it was in my day and Kaduri's day, to their imperial conquerors in Washington. Lead the Americans by the noses, tell them what to think, know that they are suckers for the myths of being an English gentleman and master spies and Bulldog Drummond and going to the old clubs and the old routes of empire. But at the same time that you're recognizing that you're dealing with people who are so ignorant and coarse and incompetent that you can lead them by the nose anyway. And it's pretty much a good metaphor for the way the British have led or misled the Americans and eagerly egged them on in recent years into yet more imperialist fiascos in the Middle East. But it is also a commentary on the underlying cultural and emotional continuity of American empire coming after British empire in the Middle East. Because Dr. Freud, who died in England but was a great patriot of the old Habsburg Empire to the day he died, and never forgave Woodrow Wilson for his role in dismantling the empire. What is one of his fundamental pioneering insights into psychology? We have to, of course, now have a modern, trendy American, useless as shit term for it: gaslighting, the 21st century. It's really Freud's model of projection, whereby totally incompetent, useless people who are guilty of the greatest incompetence and the greatest crimes will never face up to their own responsibility, will never face up to their own incompetence, to their own moral responsibility, but will blame totally harmless or admirable people instead for it. They will scapegoat their victims. This is called projection. Today, as if it's a wonderful modern American cultural insight that nobody believed in before, we call it gaslighting. And this is the explanation for what the neocons and their friends have done in with the American empire, eagerly following them from Iraq again to Afghanistan, in the Middle East, accusing everyone else of the crimes they committed. Because, of course, what else do we have in the Middle East? In Iraq, as Kaduri recognized? We have the execution of innocent people, including his own father, which he hid as a shameful secret, understandably, in his own lifetime. And I only learned by happenstance from an eminent Turkish professor whose own teacher had been Kaduri's closest friend and confidant in London 50 years before. You see here where the importance, and you are now part of this, where the importance, as the Native American peoples understand, of oral tradition, of the transmission of oral truth as an antidote and a prophylactic against and a shield against the lies of entire empires that have enslaved and in falsehood hundreds of millions of people. And you are now part of this, because as I have been before you, I am now passing on to you to pass on in turn the truths that my teachers and mentors and friends entrusted me with. And the central theme, as I say here, and we can explore other aspects of it because, of course, there are many, is that the nation of Iraq never existed, was an artificial creation, and was created by the British Empire for its own greed and power. And that for the next 37 years, the peoples of Iraq were crucified by British imperial power to maintain that fiction, which could not be maintained by democratic truth or freedom or consensus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much. And you've given us a lot to chew on. There's a few people already waiting in queue. I personally have a question about Yitzhak Rabin, which I might throw in there, but then again, Peter might
please do.
To it. But the first question that I saw coming in was from, well, actually it was Peter. Peter, you're up.
Good afternoon, Martin. Thank you, Matt. I had a couple of questions. The name Hashemite dynasty, does that come from the Hebrew word Hashem, which meant the name, as in referring to God? And the second question I had was, what was the influence of the American-based Standard Oil in Iraq in this time? Because I have read in some history books that Standard Oil did actually have a petroleum pier in Smyrna or Izmir, and continued to have that, I understand, after 1922.
Again, two excellent points, two excellent questions. As for the first one, Jews would say yes, of course. All Arabs and Muslims would say no, not remotely. And if anything, they would deny any connection or say that it comes the other way around. There is certainly no doubt that the Hashemite dynasty, the name itself comes from, is deep in Arab tradition, deep in Arab culture, no Jewish influence whatsoever. That's very simple and straightforward. As to Standard Oil, that's the point, you see. Standard Oil had interest in the whole world. And whatever else you say about John D. Rockefeller, and also his son, Junior, and his grandson, Nelson, and all of them, and David Rockefeller, they were well briefed, and they were energetic, and they were efficient, and they were smart. So, of course, they had eyes on the oil potential of the Ottoman Empire. And that was why the British were determined to have it instead of America, and why Churchill was determined to have it after 1911. And the Americans were not dreaming of anything. Even Theodore Roosevelt, well, had he come back to power, he would have gone along with the British on this. There's no question about that whatsoever. He was totally in their pocket. He was totally in their pocket. But Taft was already a disappointment to him as president in 1911. And while Wilson definitely was very happy with the thoughts of taking the empire apart, but then, of course, Wilson was a global egomaniac who thought he could redraw Europe and was ready to do the same thing. And even the Standard Oil people in 1920 were far too sensible and had seen too much of Wilson running havoc across Europe and the rest of the world to put up with him. But the British from 1911 are focused on dismantling the Ottoman Empire totally and taking control of Iraq, which means for them Mosul, northern Iraq, and cooking up whatever political and democratic and fanciful excuses that they need as the fig leaves to take over control of the oil, to maintain control of the world. And so Standard Oil remains very much on the sidelines on this. They're on the sidelines in 1922, and they are hoping, no doubt against hope, that with their support, Kemal Ataturk, who loathes the British, who has defeated Churchill everywhere that they have come up against each other, from Gallipoli in 1915 to the Dardanelles and the Straits a second time in the Shannak crisis of 1922, when he breaks the Lloyd George government and topples them from power and humiliates the British Empire. So actually, look at this. Kemal Ataturk leads a national resurgence on land that drives the British Empire out of, and their Greek puppets, out of Asia Minor, and creates a Muslim national and actually a secular Turkish national renaissance in Turkey in 1922 and 23. And the treaties of Lausanne and Sèvres confirm this in 1923. And just after this happens, Churchill then faces a second humiliation further south in the heart of Arabia itself. But although Churchill wants to gain control of Arabia, neither he nor Standard Oil dream that the ultimate oil prize is going to be found in the Dhahran oil fields, which have not yet been investigated and uncovered in the 1920s. So you're right, Standard Oil always has fingers in the game. But Churchill and the British Empire just drive them aside quite casually. Remember, it was the British who put an army into the Middle East, and two armies who conquered Palestine and Syria from the west, and who then conquer Iraq with the Indian resources of the Indian Army from the east in 1917 and 1918. The British are there with hundreds of thousands of troops. The Americans and the French are not. It's easy to sideline them. And the American people and the American Congress have no desire to share Woodrow Wilson's megalomania. In any case, Roosevelt was megalomaniac enough for 2 centuries of American rulers in the Middle East. But he had died at the beginning of 1920. Mr. Macho Man never recovered from the death of his own son as a combat pilot with the American Air Corps, AEF Air Corps, in 1918. He was macho enough to send a couple of million other American boys to their deaths. If it had happened, he wouldn't have batted an eyelid. But when it came home to him, he didn't take it that way. You've got to say this for the British. So many of the British imperialists did send their sons, and their sons, God help them, eagerly volunteered to do it, to die needlessly on the Western Front. Arthur Conan Doyle lost his son that way. General Sir Edmund Allenby, who commanded the conquest of Palestine, lost his son that way. But they were raised in English public schools. They were ruthless and hard and tough as nails, and frighteningly so. And the deaths of their own beloved children did not humanize or soften them. But it broke Teddy Roosevelt. He was just an American wimp at the end of the day, as his own father had been. His father very sensibly, but very hypocritically, dodged service and paid another man to serve instead of him in the Civil War to end slavery. Teddy Roosevelt's family idealism really didn't run very far. His own son was braver. His son became a brigadier general who rightly won the Congressional Medal of Honor as the as the most senior American ground combat commander to land on D-Day on Utah Beach. And he died of a heart attack from the physical strain he put himself under a number of weeks later. And he was proved to be a highly competent and able as well. He was a much better man than his father. But then he didn't go into politics.
Yeah, I'm going to share Martin Sieff's last lecture on Teddy Roosevelt's last mad crusade.
Oh, bless you.
Exceptional. Right now it's the chat box and the description of this video for those listening on YouTube. Bruce, you're up.
Thank you. Martin, what's your appraisal of President Kennedy in terms of his awareness of all these machinations, of all these forces, and his quest to how independent was he on behalf of America and her sovereignty and her ideals?
In my view, and I don't think this will come as a surprise to you, Bruce, President Kennedy, he had to learn a lot on the job. But if you look already at his very clear-cut record as a senator and as president, he loathed imperialism in principle. He, unlike his father, who hated Franklin Roosevelt, JFK was a true JFK, small d as well as large D Democrat. He was a deeply principled man. He was, and he was certainly an independent man as president, much more than Eisenhower was. Eisenhower we loved because Eisenhower was a liar. And Kennedy actually, along with Truman, both despised Eisenhower as a liar. I mean, Eisenhower speaks out against the military-industrial complex. Who created the military-industrial complex? Eisenhower did. 10% defense spending every year as president in the supposed time of peace. The man who built the fearful thermonuclear arsenal and provoked, and the Stalin and his successors, Khrushchev certainly would have built theirs anyway. You must not idealize them, over-idealize them. But it was Eisenhower who creates the thermonuclear standoff. It is Eisenhower who creates the modern CIA. It is Eisenhower who appoints the Dulles brothers to their nefarious positions. It is Eisenhower under whom the dark forces of CIA assassination within the United States are allowed to run with impunity against anyone who speaks out of line. And Kennedy wants to rein this in, but of course, he is too principled and too independent. And he himself, of course, is assassinated openly. The only American leader to die in office in 1960, and the only one to be openly assassinated in 122 years now since President McKinley. And this is done deliberately, openly, pour encourager les autres, to encourage the rest, to keep everybody else since him in line. And when it looks very briefly as if President Ford is going to step out of 9, 2 ludicrous crackpot women are allowed within a week of each other to get within shooting distance of President Ford with pop guns, both with 22s. Pathetic, ludicrous. As I've said before, you might also look at something that was not done by us, which I think our people don't even have the wit to realize was orchestrated, and that is the elimination of America's own strongest friend in Japan of the past 50 years. The assassination of Shinzo Abe, again by a convenient crackpot who is set up from an an exceptionally pro-American and pro-Korean organization, the Unification Church. How convenient! You're killing several. You're not only killing because, of course, there is a new emperor in Tokyo, unlike his father or his grandfather for the last 44 years of his reign. He is going to be setting policy behind the chrysanthemum curtain. But it's the same model. You know, you have a useful crackpot, as was used to eliminate President McKinley, or you have a useful patsy, as even the X-Files recognized and taught was used to eliminate President Kennedy. And by the way, the contempt for the American people chosen, not in scapegoating poor Lee Harvey Oswald, but in using a Carcano rifle, which anyone who has ever known as a rifle knows is the least user-friendly rifle and most difficult and slow to reload of any widespread use in modern design. They didn't even bother trying to give him a credible weapon. The contempt for how we can control these idiots through the noses, through CNN and CBS and the New York Times and Time magazine, is palpable with these people, and was then. Now, President Kennedy was an honorable and courageous and principled figure, and that was why he was martyred.
Thank you.
Mm.
And now you see why nobody should have the slightest doubt, why I can never entertain the slightest hope of appearing as a thoughtful figure on CNN or PBS or on the New York Times editorial page or the Washington Post. Why perish the thought?
Yeah, that's become a bit of a morally compromised cesspool anyway. You wouldn't want to.
Precisely.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to be ashamed enough to step into
There
that.
was a teacher of mine, a mean, a vicious son of a bitch. Let's name him George McConnell. But he knew his history, and he was a great teacher to me in both economics and history and politics. And he didn't teach me everything, but he didn't know where to begin. But what he taught me was sound and brilliant and a marvelous start to my professional life. And he was once asked by one of my friends in class when we were about 17 years old, his comment about a highly respected British and Northern Ireland unionist politician at the time. And he replied with refreshing candor and accuracy, I wouldn't piss on him if he was burning to death. That should basically be everyone's attitude towards all the regular contributors to the New York Times and Washington Post editorial pages. Do not piss on them when they are burning to death. Let that be, even after thermonuclear war,
I wish
stand as our comment and assessment of them.
I wish I could have been there last night to hear your New Year's toasts. I mean,
Actually, they were very mild. We just like watching Twilight Zone reruns. And the ball come down in Times Square, you know.
Stephen.
But let that be one today, right?
Yeah.
A good way to toast in the new year.
Amen. All right, Stephen, go for it.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Marty, thanks for another most enjoyable lecture. Learned a lot, found it valuable. Obviously, the oil dimension to the British machinations in Iraq and the Middle East are huge. And I was kind of wondering, based on what you know about that, what's your read on the Yemeni war? And in the chat, I threw in an article by energy analyst F. William Engdahl, in which he alleges that there's a suspicion that northern Yemen, sort of the amorphous desert border between that and Saudi Arabia, has potential oil reserves that exceed those of Saudi Arabia. So I'm just wondering what you see in terms of hidden hands operating behind that conflict.
I've not followed that conflict closely. There is no, I've actually not come across, and this is a reflection of my ignorance more than anything else. I'd like to see if anyone has any links to this. I have never heard before of anyone suspecting links of significant oil to Yemen, and it would seem, even if they are there, and they may well be there, and they could probably be very accessible with modern technology, but if it had ever been suspected in the past, 100 years, the history of Yemen would have been much more prominent and much more directly involved from both the British, who were so close to it in Aden, let alone the US, which did such an energetic and comprehensive job of maintaining its access to the Saudi fields over such a long period of time. So I don't know. But a lot of people who I respect, including Bill Engel, have followed this, the outrageous infliction of endless civilian casualties on Yemen at the behest of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates for a very long time. And it's very clear that, the Saudis and the UAE people are terrified that the Houthi rebellion backed by Iran can outflank them and potentially destabilize them from Yemen. An enormous number of workers who do the actual work of being hewers of wood and drawers of water, and most of all pumpers of oil in Saudi Arabia over the past 50, 60 years have come from the surface population of extremely poor and impoverished Yemen. And this presents an enormous potential security threat, which the Saudis and the US have both very well recognized for a very long time. But this brings us to a much wider issue, and one that, again, I am largely ignorant of, but which Alex Craner is an expert on, I think, and which a number of other people, including you, Matt, have followed very closely indeed, and that is the fact that Saudi Arabia, and where the Saudis go, the United Arab Emirates will invariably follow, is in the throes of switching from the Biden administration to Russia-Chinese support within the context and framework of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, this is an enormously risky thing for Mohammed bin Salman to do. And it reflects both the total incompetence of the Biden administration in dealing with them, and of the wider American deep state in dealing with them. And it also reflects, at worst, a recklessness, and at best, a very degree of significant considered courage on his part. Because the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has to know what happened to King Faisal of Saudi Arabia in 1975 and why. When he was conveniently assassinated after breaking free of US financial and economic and strategic control in the oil crisis from 73 to 75, and he gets shot dead at one of his own traditional family gatherings by his own distant nephew, who of course had spent most of his time harmlessly chasing girls and drugs. Not so harmlessly chasing drugs, in fact, because that of course made him susceptible to many conditioning and other influence. And the pattern of the King Faisal assassination in 1975, shortly after Faisal has shown his open defiance of the United States in general, and of Western finance in particular, in general, and of then Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger in particular, takes place very conveniently. And since then, not a single Saudi ruler has dared to wander off the US oil reservation, usually directed from Texas, but New York, Washington, Houston, it's all the same. Nobody has ever seriously looked at that assassination, even though the external patterns of it so obviously fit the patterns of assassination of the Kennedy brothers, of Malcolm X, of Dr. King, and the crippling and therefore removement from effective national political power and influence in the United States of the former governor of Alabama, who was a threat to the system from the right rather than the left, but was nevertheless simply a threat to the existing system. So this is the wider context in which to view Yemen. I don't know enough about the geology or the exploratory geology of Yemen. I would personally remain skeptical about that. There are speculation, it's inevitable, and I've done it myself. that speculation, that people who challenge the consensus, there will inevitably questions that reach too far. I don't see credible evidence of oil in Yemen so far, but there are the two key factors, certainly, which are already clear, should be obvious, are A, that the Houthi rebellion in Yemen is enormously threatening and potentially destabilizing to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and that secondly, for reasons of his own, Mohammed bin Salman, and this, as I say, can involve recklessness, which we know he has been prone to, and it can also involve principled courage, which we should not deny him being capable of either, is now moving systematically, or trying to move systematically, out of the US orbit into what he clearly regards as the more reliable and predictable and more responsible orbit of Russia and China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Thanks, Marty.
Got a quick question for you, Marty. The assassinated Saudi king, Faisal, was he in any way involved with the faction of Saudi princes who in the 60s were organized to become part of sort of this pro-Nasser movement in Saudi Arabia, or was he not a part of that?
Not remotely. He was
No.
made king of Saudi Arabia precisely to eliminate them and to eliminate the danger of them, which he did. That, by the way, stemmed from another American miscalculation, and that was that President Eisenhower did not understand the Middle East for a second, was totally ignorant of it, and so were the Dulles brothers. They were eager to replace the British. They were still playing the old imperial games. They underestimated the Soviets and Khrushchev, but most of all, they overestimated the British, Churchill and Eden, and their obsession was eliminating Britain from Iraq and taking over control of the oil of Iraq. And of course, they had already displaced the British in Iran in 1953. That was all they cared about. So they made Nasser a major revolutionary force, threatening all the kingdoms of the Middle East, but most of all, Saudi Arabia, which was most important to them, by their own stupid miscalculation. And that was a direct Eisenhower-Dulles brothers miscalculation, and it was enormous. And it effectively gave the Soviets control of the oil of Iraq and the political future and destiny of Iraq until Henry Kissinger, working with Saddam, eventually with Anwar Sadat, and the George Herbert Walker Bush new generation of American imperialist rulers who did understand oil in the Middle East an awful lot better, successfully supplanted and corrected what you could call the Eisenhower error. It was really the Eisenhower fuck-up in the 1950s. As usual, because Ike gives his thoughtful speech about the military-industrial complex after he spent the 8 years creating it at a level of spending more than twice that of Harry Truman before him, or of Kennedy and Johnson and even Nixon after him. Eisenhower manages to make himself look good while passing off all the problems to his successors. He briefs President Kennedy. He puts President Kennedy in the crosshairs of the assassin's bullet. He says to President Kennedy, "Oh, look at this terrible military-industrial complex. Of course I disapprove of it, but I couldn't do anything about it. That's up to you." And it is he who has made the military-industrial complex and the agency burn-proof. It all comes back to Eisenhower, and it's the same in Saudi Arabia. King Faisal's half-brother is toppled as king. Before him, King Saud, the first of Ibn Saud's sons to take over, doesn't have a clue how to deal with the Nasser menace, doesn't have a clue how to build social stability in Saudi Arabia, doesn't have a clue how to build a plausible anti-Nasser coalition to stop the revolutionaries who first took over in Egypt with America's support and blessing, and then took over in Iraq, also with America's support and blessing. And yet it's letting the Soviets in every time. And Eisenhower is too stupid and complacent to realize Saudi Arabia, which America does not want to lose, will be next in the crosshairs. But King Faisal realizes this. And it's Faisal's again, the Americans don't understand. At first, they welcome Faisal because they desperately need him to stop the Russians in their tracks and to stop Nasser and his revolutionaries in the tracks. And he does both brilliantly. I discuss this, and I even managed to get this into my Middle East book, although there was lots of other stuff, of course, I could not get into my Middle East book. But if you look at my Middle East book, which is now in its second printing, and has actually been translated into Spanish at least as well, I managed to discuss the outlines of this quite comprehensively there. What I can't even remember the title of my own book, The So-and-so's Guide to the Middle East. I can hang on, I look it up. I have a copy here still somewhere.
The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Middle East. That's the name. Politically Incorrect Guide to the Middle East. It's too late. We'll have time for one more question. I think it's going to be.
Hang on, I couldn't even find that. But look, anyone else can find it for me on
Politically
on Amazon.
Incorrect Guide to the Middle East is your book.
Yes, that's my book exactly. Okay. Next question.
Yeah, let's edit. Yeah, we have time for one more question, and Dennis Ballantine asks, "Thank you, Martin. Where does Iraq fit into the current geopolitical framework moving forward vis-a-vis relationships in the evolving global power structure?"
I believe, and I've believed for a long time, it is inevitable now because of the bunglings of American policy for so long. We are going to see a modern Anschluss. The famous 1938 Anschluss was when Hitler and Nazi Germany occupied Austria in March 1938 or April 1938, and at a stroke, because of the feebleness of Britain and France at that time and their capability of preventing him or rolling him back, and they could easily have still intervened, but because they did not, that changed the balance of Europe and made World War II inevitable. There's a lot of talk, incidentally, on that about gallant Czechoslovakia and how we betrayed them and how they were willing to fight. Well, the historical record belays this. Slovaks, independent Slovakia now, are an incredibly brave, martial, gallant people. They died and sacrificed themselves in their hundreds of thousands because they were loyal to the Habsburg throne in World War I and run by the most incompetent generals, even of World War I, Konrad von Hutzenbach and his fellow assholes in Vienna. Contemptible. But the Slovaks were brave and admirable. And in World War II, the Slovak rebellion against the Nazis opened, at again the cost of scores of thousands of their own lives, opened up the Carpathian passes to the Red Army and was crucial to the freeing of Central Europe from the Nazis by the Red Army. And this is totally ignored, not just by the West, but the Czechs always treated the Slovaks with the most appalling and unbelievable racism and contempt. They treated them at least as bad as antebellum slave owners in the American South treated all black people. It was that bad. It was that bad. But the Czechs themselves, you see, were good at flattering Woodrow Wilson and Lloyd George and British and American leaders. But they never fight for anyone. They did not fight to defend themselves against the Spanish Inquisition in 1618. They tried to avoid fighting in World War I. What are they famous for in World War I? The good soldier Sieff, who was the only guy who doesn't fight for the Austrian Empire and thereby incidentally saves his life. Did any Czechs fight to oppose Stalin's takeover in 1948? Not one. In 1968, a single Czech student commits ritual suicide, burns himself to death. But no other Czechs follow him or rise up. They don't do what the brave Poles did, what the brave Slovaks did, what the brave Hungarians did in 1956. Eastern Europe, what the brave Ukrainians are trying to do now. Eastern Europe is filled with brave, admirable peoples who should, the most sensible of whom came to America, and the rest of whom were sacrificed in ghastly bungles and imperial wars. The Eisenhower administration, Eisenhower again, encourages the Hungarian people to rise up against the Soviet Union in 1956, when it very sensibly has no intention of supporting the Hungarian people against the thermonuclear superpower for a second. Not for a second. That's the kind of thing you're dealing with here. But that's the story behind Czechoslovakia. But back with Iran and Iraq. The Austrians in 1938 are bitter nationalist German rump of what used to be the old Central European Habsburg Empire. And overwhelmingly, they do want to join the Nazis. And the worst of the Nazis, including the architects of the final solution of genocide of the Jews, are Austrian Germans. Most of them aren't even German Germans. Eichmann is an Austrian German. So is Hitler himself, right? So once the Austrian Empire is gone, it is inevitable that Austria will be sucked into Nazi Germany if the Westerners are stupid enough to let it. This is what we see in Iraq today. The majority of Iraqis, as I said before, are Arab by race, but Iraq is a very recent fiction invented by Churchill. But they have only been Shiite for 120 years, since so many Arabs in Iraq converted to Shiism to avoid the military draft in the supposedly more efficient Ottoman army, Turkish army. This was a recent development. But since then, since 1979, Iranian in general and Shiite radicalized religious leaders and culture in particular have been very effective in organizing in Iraq. And that's the way they're going to go. So that is the future of Iraq. Iraq will be dismembered, and most of Iraq, including the oil regions, are going to be absorbed in an Anschluss or union with the Iranian Islamic Republic. The Iranian Islamic Republic still has a lot of life and potential threat to the West left in it. And while they work, and of course they are now sensible enough to have joined the SCO, and they have their own agenda. It's not a Chinese agenda, it's a Russian agenda, but it's compatible with SCO agendas, and it's especially compatible with India's agenda and with China's agenda, because Iran still has massive natural gas and oil reserves and will have vastly more if it takes over the Shiite-controlled regions of Iraq, and can therefore supply land-based Eurasian additional oil supplies to China, especially, that the United States Navy and Air Force cannot interdict across the Indo-Pacific region.
Interesting. There's one last question that popped in. Magdalena, I saw your hand raise. Go for it. Oh, yes, you're taking yourself. Hey there, Jerry.
Okay, Jerry is doing. Oh, you hear me?
Oh, it's Jerry. Okay. Hey, Jerry.
Okay, good. Oh,
Great.
was wonderful. Had so much. I always love the way you talk about Churchill, but your description of Eisenhower was priceless. I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask you a question. I wanted to pick your brain because a lot of the talk of the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, I had the name Adnan Khashoggi. I remember back, he was involved with the Iran-Contra, and do his eyeballs and dirty tricks.
Yes.
Lately, he's kind of, and I just wanted to pick your brain if you know more about.
Hold on, Jerry, are you there? Come into my study. Walk several. Yeah, come. All right. Sorry, the connection there is just off. Like I couldn't really Here, Jerry's come by for the festivities.
Yes, I think I got the Jerry is so
I don't think
clear
he got his
that I can get all the rest of it.
Here he is.
But
Here.
let's.
All
He
right.
certainly deserves coherent communications.
All right.
Oh, boy.
Hey man, good to see you as always.
Hello, Martin. I'm in the captain's seat now.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask you a question about Adnan Khashoggi, because years ago I remember reading about him with the Iran-Contra affair, and he was up to his eyeballs in dirty tricks there. And then recently, he went into the embassy and we never saw him again. And I know they're trying to blame the crown prince in Saudi Arabia on anything, but I was just wanted to know if you had any of your thinking on that you could enlighten us with.
It's your thinking that has really, as usual, being exceptionally helpful and enlightening. Thank you again, Jerry. I have no doubt he met a hideous end. There is no doubt that the way he went was barbaric. It's been very well documented and confirmed. But again, as you rightly say, this was not St. Francis of Assisi. This was not President John F. Kennedy or Dr. King.
Mhm.
This was another Nuri aside. The Crown Prince had and his people were seriously concerned about this man. And from their perspective, I do not wish to justify the hideous way he was killed. It was simply barbaric.
Mhm.
He had provoked a lot of fear. And like Nuri Assad, he was one of the rare occasions of a repulsive and contemptible human being who had supported the most abominable crimes and aggressions and cynical rapes and destructions of entire countries for his own selfish support as well, without conscience and without remorse for decades. So repulsive and horrific as his death was, I would not waste any piss on him either.
Even if he was burning.
Well, he died in an equally horrific way. And no, I would not, exactly. Far too many innocent people died as a result of machinations of which he was so enthusiastically and selfishly and pettily a part. Again, a wonderful question, Jerry, and again, as usual with you, you throw much more light than the answers with your own questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Martin.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, this was fun. And Peter just threw in a couple of points here. I think he's probably inspired by some of the work by Whitney Webb, recommending that people check out the BCCI connection of, Khashoggi's uncle, I guess? The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which was a uber corrupt money laundering terrorist financing bank. Very useful, yeah. And Whitney did some good work in that.
Absolutely.
Marty, thank you so much for developing and sharing today. This was a really great way to start the new year. Really, really appreciate that. Alex Craner also says, thank you, Martin. Fantastic and very illuminating lecture. So next week we have Bruce de Torres, who's going to revive the spirit of JFK and a little bit more. So that'll be fun next Sunday, 2 p.m. usual time. Marty, thank you. And everybody, thank you for showing up today.
Thank you again. Thank you so much, all of you, especially, of course, you, Matt. Thank you so much. Happy New Year, friends.
Bye.